Hi, I'm Mike Roussos from the .NET Customer Success team, and today I'm going to talk about localization and resources in ASP.NET Core. Now, when we talk about globalization and localization, those are two related topics that overlap a lot. When we say globalization, that means taking your app and getting it ready to run in multiple locales. So maybe updating it so that when it parses input, it can handle international characters or date times and numbers that maybe are in a different format. When we talk about localization, that means taking your application and updating it to show culture-specific assets depending on which locale you're running in. So taking it, and typically that will mean translating strings and messages that you're showing to the user to different languages when the user's in a different culture, in a different locale. Or maybe it could mean updating images so that different images are showed for different locales. Now, in the .NET framework, you typically would have done this with the resource manager type. You would use the resource manager or a resource reader to retrieve resources that are embedded in your assembly or in satellite assemblies, and the resource manager would get the correct resource that matched the culture of the thread's current UI culture. That approach still works fine in ASP.NET Core. You can continue to use a resource manager, and it will work just like it always has. You also have an option, though, of using some new types we've introduced. iString Localizer and the related iHTML Localizer are slightly easier to use APIs built on top of Resource Manager as a productive way of quickly retrieving strings to display to your users. They're basically the same. The only difference is that iHTML Localizer allows you to include HTML directly in the strings, and it will not encode that HTML. It'll leave the string raw and just encode the arguments that are formatted into it, whereas the string localizer always encodes HTML characters so that they're safe to display in a view. And it won't be treated as HTML. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this is done. So the very first thing you have to do is you have to make sure that whatever mechanism you're using for retrieving resources is available in your app's dependency injection container. So if you're going to use a resource manager, that's easy. You just take your service collection called add singleton, and you add the resource manager. And the resource manager then gets the path to where the resources it should be loading are, the assembly that they're in, and you're good to go. Now I'm doing this, by the way, in program.cs just to show that there's multiple ways to configure your services in ASP.NET Core. It's typically done mostly in startup.cs, but you can call this helper method when you're creating your web host builder. And so at web host creation time, you can configure the DI container as well, just so it's ready a little bit earlier. Like I said, typically it's done in startup.cs though. And so here, if we're going to be using string localizers, you're going to set that up a little bit differently. For that, in your configure services method, you call services.add localization. And this is going to make the iString localizer and iHTML localizer types available in your DI container. Optionally, you can set a number of different options here, but one very useful one is to set the resources path. This will be the prefix that ASP.NET Core expects all of your resources to have in your assembly. So because we're typically going to be gathering regex files in one location, like here they're all in this resources folder, I can set my resources path as resources, and now the string localizers know to look under that resources location because that'll be the prefix for all of the paths to the resources that they're going to load. A little bit about how resources are named. So you got this prefix here, resources. Then after that, it's going to look for regex files whose names match the types that the resources correspond to. So for example, let's say that I'm going to use an iString localizer here in this customer's controller type. By default, the resources that will be loaded will be from a regex file that has the fully qualified name of this type. So that's customers API.controllers.customers controller. Now in this case, my namespace begins with the same name as the assembly name. So the assembly name is customers API. In that case, if the assembly name is the same as the beginning of your namespace name, you can skip that assembly name and just start the naming after that. So in this case, the name for the regex file should be controllers.customercontroller. So you can see inside my resources folder, which is that resources path I specified, I have controllers/customers controller. This also could be controllers.customers controller if I preferred to do dot pathing instead of nested folder pathing. It's just a style preference. In this case, I know that all of my controllers will be in the controller's namespace, and I think that this is nice, just separation in the source, so I'm using a path instead of a dot. In here, I have a resx file for each language that I care about. In this case, I have US English resources, French resources for the France locale, and I have neutral Spanish resources. And I included these so that I can show both specific culture and neutral culture resources. So in case you're not aware, there's two types of culture infos in .NET. There's specific cultures, which will be a language and a region. So like English in the US, French in France. And that's a very specific locale. You also have neutral cultures, which are just the language. Spanish. Spanish could be Mexican Spanish, could be Spanish in Spain. When I specify a neutral resource, or neutral culture, that means that anyone who requests a specific culture which derives from that neutral one, they can fall back and use these neutral resources. So in this example, if someone requested French resources for France, they would get resources from this resx file. If they requested French resources for Canada, they would not. But because this is a neutral Spanish resx file, if someone requests resources for Mexican Spanish or for Spanish in Spain, in both cases they can fall back and use these resources. So whether you use specific culture resources or neutral culture resources, just depends on how specific your resources need to be and whether they can be shared between different locales with a common language. So that's the resources. Now kind of backing up to where we were, setting this all up. You call add localization, you can specify a resources path. Now there's the question of how do we know which resources to use for an incoming request? Because in the old desktop model of .NET Framework, or even in .NET Core, just using the resource manager out of the box, the .NET Framework will look at the current thread's UI culture and make decisions based on that of which resources to gather. But in a web app, you might have multiple resources coming in from multiple different locations all around the planet, and they all need different cultures' resources. So for that, there is special middleware. So down in your configure method in Startup, if you want to use localization in your app, you need to include a call to use request localization. This will register the localization middleware, which will change the culture per request. So we include request localization options, which say which cultures we support. So here's my localization options. By default, I'm going to use US English resources. So if a request comes into my web app and the caller has not specified what culture the resources they want, we'll just give them US English. Or if they make a request and specify a culture that we don't support, we'll give them US English. We then specify which cultures we do support, and here it's just an array of culture infos, so these line up with the resx files I have. We've got US English, French in France, and neutral Spanish. We specify that for both supported cultures and supported UI cultures. Now, there's a difference here between your current culture and your current UI culture. Current culture is what's going to indicate things like how we format numbers or dates, things like that. Current UI culture is what's used when we retrieve localized resources. In most cases, these are going to be set to the same. In some cases, you might have resources for more or less regions than for some reason you want to support for formatting numbers and dates. So these are separate. So once you've configured this, we've added this middleware to our pipeline, and notice that it's before the MVC middleware or any of this other interesting middleware that might depend on resources, because the middleware pipeline executes in order. So by the time we call MVC or anything else which is going to be depending on the current culture to be set to the right value, we need to have had the use request localization middleware execute before that so that it can update the current culture and the current UI culture. Once that's done, though, then within our controllers and these other middleware components, we can then use our resource manager and the culture will be set correctly, or we can use string localizers and they'll pull correct strings. So let's look at how we use the string localizer. Here is let's see, where is it? Here is an action where it's a get action where the user wants to retrieve information about a customer. If they want information for a customer who doesn't exist, we're going to return a not found object result. And in there, we want to give them a message. So we have, this is our iString localizer, and it has an index operator. So we can just say localizer index, and then the key name for the resource that we want to use. So in this case, customer not found. If we look at our resx file, we can see that that's going to return the string could not find customer with ID of 0. And this 0 is a parameter which we can format a value into. So in addition to the key name in Localizer's indexer, we also can have a parameter for additional parameters for arguments that need to be formatted in to this string. So by calling localizer of customer not found, we're going to go and look up the correct customer not found message for the user's current locale. We'll format the ID into it, and that's the message that's going to be included. Note that we call .value because when you call localizer index customer not found, you get a resource object back. And so what you want to do is on there, you can call .value. So you get a localized string object. You call .value to get the string itself. You also could use this to find out whether the resource was present or if you've got a default value, things like that. But typically, you're just going to call .value. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is that the string localizer has an interesting behavior when a resource isn't found, which is kind of convenient. If we look up a resource that doesn't exist, the localizer will return to us a localized string whose value is the same as the key we gave it. So this opens up an interesting architecture opportunity for your apps if you're interested. What it means is that when you're creating an application, maybe you know that you want to localize it down the road, so you're going to use an iString localizer instead of hard coding messages. But maybe you don't have resx files yet and you don't want to translate. In that case, you can just be very productive by just using an iString localizer and making the key that you retrieve the default message that you're going to use. So if the user, if we don't have a different culture specified, here's the default string we want to use, just make that the key. That means you don't even have to have a resx file initially. You just use an iString localizer. Because the keys don't exist in the resx files, we're just going to use the key as the value. So out of the box, you're going to run your new app, and all of the strings are going to be the default values which you used as the keys, and everything's going to look good and make sense. Then later, when you do want to localize your app, all you have to do is add resx files for the different languages you want to support and include values with those default strings as the keys and the translated strings as the values. And now, just like that, you've got a localized app, and you didn't have to do anything with the resx files initially. Now that's just an option. You still may want to just use a dedicated key like I'm doing in this sample. The advantage of that, of course, is you have a nice, short, succinct key and you don't have some long string as your key. So if you're going to be working on localization kind of early on in your project, this is probably the way to go. But if you don't want to bother with resx files initially, you could take advantage of the fact that the key you look up will be the default value if that key is not present in resx files. So that's kind of the basis, like the basics of localization and resources in ASP.NET Core. Of course, if you want to use a resource manager, like I said, down here, we've got a helper method. Our helper method is just calling resource manager get string, and you give it the resource name. That's going to work the same as it always has. We do have a couple other helpers, though, for when you're working with views, because you may want to localize the contents of a MVC view. So let me, first I'll demo this before I jump into that. I'm getting ahead of myself. I should show this working just to show you that it does work. Oh, and I should also talk about how the user indicates which culture they're in, because that's an interesting question as well. So, okay, so my app's running. So now I can come over here into Postman, and I can connect to, what's it running on? It's listening on, I believe, 5,000. Okay, so we'll go to localhost 5,000 API customers. I'm just going to pass in some bogus value here, 58. Because I didn't specify a culture, I get the English string back. Could not find customer with ID. And here it's just saying, like this is supposed to be a GUID. You didn't even give me a GUID, so here's a default GUID. Okay, there's a few ways that we can customize this. One easy one is that customers and users can specify the culture that they want in a query string. So if I say culture is French, now I get a French resource. Another way, and probably a more common way that this is going to happen, is in an accepts language header. So if we say accept language, no, not accept car set, accept language, I can say that the language I accept is Mexican Spanish. Now, Mexican Spanish wasn't one of the resources in my app, but neutral Spanish was, so we fall back to that, and we get a Spanish message here. Now, this is going to come up a lot because in a lot of web browsers, you can set a requested language in the browser, and that will translate into an accept language header in all of the requests that go from that browser. So this may come up. The other way you can do it, if you look at our documentation, is that you can use a cookie. So if there's an ASP.NET Core culture cookie present, then that will be consulted to determine the current culture and current UI culture. Also, while I'm here, let me just call out that our documentation on this is pretty solid. If you go out to docs.microsoft.com/ASP.NET/Core fundamentals, go to the Globe Loc section. This is going to have all the information in this video plus more, so you can get all the details there. One other thing to call out, though, is that these are the three default ways of determining the culture to return to the user. You've got the header, a query string, or a cookie. But you can customize this, and you can have any method you want if you set the options for it. So, like for example, in our documentation, docs.microsoft.com, you can see the culture that it's using right embedded in the path. You could do something like that if you wanted. The way that works is that you come over into your startup class, and you go to where you're configuring your request localization options. And one of the things you can do with your request localization options is that there's a request culture providers list, which is a list of all of the ways that we inspect an incoming request to determine its culture. And you can just insert your own. So you can say request culture providers.insert, new custom request culture provider, and then you just give a func that takes the HTTP context for the incoming request, does whatever business logic it needs to. So like, for example, we could do HTTP context.request.path, and we could look at the path or whatever you want. And then when it's done with that logic, it returns a new provider culture result for the culture that should be used for that request. So in this way, you can sort of customize your app to get cultures out of the incoming request whatever way you like. But the defaults are from the accept language header, from a culture query string, or from a cookie. Now, what I was going to show before I got sidetracked there was you also have some features here where you can localize a view. So over here is an MVC app, and I have a view, and I want to localize some stuff here. So I'm going to use the iView localizer. So the way you set this up, coming over into startup.cs, again, you have add localization, but then when you call services.addMVC when you're setting up DI, you also call .addViewLocalization after it, and that's going to tell it that our views may be requesting view localizers, and we have to be able to inject those. You can specify the format of the resx files. Also notice that by default, the resx files are expected to live next to the view. That's because I haven't specified a resource path in this case, the way I did in my other project. If I specified a resources path here, then what would happen is we would expect to look under that resources path and there find a views folder, and inside the views folder would be resx files for all of the views, and they would have the format of the view's name. So it would be the controller dot or slash action dot culture dot resx, and like I mentioned here in this comment. In this case, though, I don't have a resources path, so by default we just will look for the next of the views. But again here, this is the same as the string localizer. Well, actually like the HTML localizer, because you'll notice that I actually am using the style here where the key is my default value. And in here you can see that I expect there to be HTML. And so iView localizer is a version of an iHTML localizer. So it allows HTML in the values. Now, that's not going to come up a lot because you typically just localize the contents, not the HTML. But if you want to, it's an option. But you can see here that I have some strings for English, Spanish, French again. So if I go ahead and launch this app, This will come up. The other thing I'll mention while that's starting is that if you look in the startup.cs, you'll see that I also have added data annotations localization. And what that means is that if I'm using data annotations to automatically give like validation messages, for example, here's a custom view model object that uses data annotations. It's required. If the user doesn't include this value, then here's the error message. If you've done .add data annotation localization, then you can just include a resource key here, and we'll go look that up in resx files whose names match the type of the view model object or the data transfer object. So here you can see we've done that. So we've got different validation messages for data annotations depending on the user's locale. Coming back to this sample though, this is up and running, so I'm going to navigate out to localhost 5001, go to my About page, give it a minute to get going. Okay, so here you can see the default English resources because again, same as before, I've said that my default request culture is US English, so we're picking up the US English resources. But if I wanted to, I could say that my culture is Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and just like that, we are now getting in our view the HTML from our Spanish resources. So again, you can do localization with a resource manager the same as you always have in .NET when you're working in an ASP.NET Core app. But if you like, you can also take advantage of the iString localizer, iHTML localizer, and iView localizer types as a pretty productive way to pull resources that will be localized to the culture that your users have requested either through an accept language header or one of the other mechanisms that we talked about in this video.